Glember, The Tale of a Monster, written, recorded, and illustrated by A.K. Brookman. Chapter 11, The Great Gargol Claw Statue. Day 30. On the 30th day we turned around the edge of a rising mountain to find an old settlement nestled within it. I would come to question why the places we visited held so little life, why the hollow echoes of past folk alone cried out as if from the soil or the shoddy structures. There was a quaint peace about this place, as though one could step from one of its doors or look out upon the surrounding lands from a shutter and breathe in the air as though it were not only bound into freedom, but that freedom could be heard in that sweep of the wind, the drifting to and fro of the hanging limbs of the great trees, and even in the burr seeds that clung to the cloth of her kinsmen. But there were no kinsmen, and somehow, what aura this place should have given off, it could no longer. The quietude here was born of something more, of some suffering that took this way of life and pressed it back into the soil without pity. It whispered of that forlorn. Although I could not find a single sign of life, or havoc, or suffering, I could feel it. This place, in its soft harmony, relayed with great welling pain that some harrowing winds carried its life away. It felt like death, the loss of beauty to something wretchedly cold and perverse. It should have been something beautiful, yet cursed is how it felt. Glember took his footfalls against the cobbled way with effort. His eyes seemed to be drawn toward this or that part of the village as though a lover waited there calling out to him, and he would begin to turn before forcibly preventing himself from doing so. I wondered that he had murdered its inhabitants to the last innocent life. I could feel his discomfort for my eyes upon him. I was certain it was guilt. In the center of the village, however, I beheld something I did not expect. There was a great hand lifting from what was likely the market square. It was large and hewn of stone, and could only have been crafted with a mastery of the trade and a great number of men. It was impressive, and I was awestruck, and I shuddered at the sight of it. It called to mind that red drawing upon the wall of Rockshade Cave, for it was the hand of a gargoyle. Rather, it was the claw. It lifted as high as the trees its 3 large fingers, as though in worship of some evil. I found myself shaking my head, and realized Glember looked directly at me, studying my face. He said nothing but turned away. He stood there a moment, as if considering. He must have thought the better of it, because he suddenly took up stride once again. I suddenly wanted to be gone from this place. Had its inhabitants bestowed upon the gargoyle an odd esteem, only to regret it? Where were they now, and what happened to them? I wanted to ask the gargoyle, but he seemed too agitated. I half expected him to leash out at any moment, though I could not say why. He did not linger, though, and I was glad for it. We continued on our way through its court and streets, ultimately leaving it behind. At the edge of the village, I could wait no longer to speak. Despite the gargoyle's obvious tension, I demanded a moment of privacy to relieve myself. Although he would not consent to me walking far, he allowed me at least the liberty to turn the other way as I saw to the task. And when I was done with this and began to walk back toward the path, he only laughed as I struck my heel against something solid and fell. I had gouged the side of my leg on a protruding stone cylinder, half buried and protruding from the soil, hidden among the dense foliage. The gargoyle, perhaps thinking I was attempting some scheme, quickly closed the distance between us to stand over me. Taking note of my gaping wound and bleeding, he laughed again. "You could help me to my feet," I said, but the gargoyle was no longer paying me or my wound heed. He was staring back toward the village. I looked back on instinct. I could still see that great claw looming in the town's open court, and I wished I had not bothered to look back. I managed to get to my feet without the gargoyle's help. He gave one last look at the stone cylinder, as though it was more of a curiosity than my injury, and then he turned for me. "Try to keep up, human," he said, "and watch where you're going." It felt as though he was bridling a great deal of anger. "The most obvious things," he muttered, "are right at your feet." Day 31 and 32. The 31st day passed without note, without word shared, and many a stone scaled. Midway through the 32nd day, Glember broke the silence with a sudden statement, looking back at me. "My father told me humans were weak," Glember said. "I agree," he added. "He also said they were ugly," Glember muttered on. He looked at me and turned away. "I agree with that, too," he said. "It sounds as though you and your father agree on most things," I said. "Agreed," Glember said. I thought it odd he was agreeing with me now, and then I realized what he meant, just as he decided it pertinent to emphasize the point. "I mean, we agreed," Glember said, "when he was still alive." I didn't say anything for a while, then offered, "I'm sorry, Glember." Glember shrugged. "I lost my father too," I said. Glember said nothing. It appeared as though he didn't care. "But he was only human," I added, "just ugly and weak." Glember grinned. "So I suppose that doesn't really count, huh?" I said. Again, Glember only shrugged. "Well, growing up," I said, "my father and I didn't agree on anything." Glember considered my words. "We only disagreed on one thing," Glember said, referring to his father. "Really?" I asked. "Just one," Glember answered. "Amazing," I said as we continued on our way. "My father and I disagreed on half of everything we spoke about," I said. "And the other half, I pretended to disagree, just to be a thorn." "He should have whipped you more," Glember said. This time I grinned. "Did your father whip you, Glember?" I asked. "Is that why you're such a grouch?" I was smiling genuinely when I realized he had turned to me. "No, human," he said. "Your people murder, torture, and plague my people," he said. "That is why I am the way I am." He had ended his walk. I took a few more steps and then stopped as well. "You sound like you need a hug, Glember," I said mockingly. "Thing is," I began, pointing to the pack on my back, "giving hugs is hazardous to my health these days. The pack, the shackles, the chains," I said. "Oh, and there is that rather large spike pointing to my spine," I nodded. "Nearly forgot about that," I added. Glember's eyes narrowed as if he was preparing to say something. I could see the muscles of his jaw flex. Instead, he turned from me and began walking without words. "Perhaps I can hug you from the side, Glember," I offered, hurrying to catch his flank while putting one arm and leg out to the side. "Glember, I can hug you from the side," Glember continued on, ignoring my words. I frowned, falling in beside him. It seemed as though his talkative mood had shifted. I, however, was not through. "Well, my offer still stands, Glemmy," I said, with a serious tone as we navigated the rocky terrain. "However," I went on, "I have to draw the line somewhere." Glember was shaking his head ever so slightly. He was getting angry. "Just a quick hug," I said firmly. "If you begin humping my leg, or if you try to kiss—" My words ended. Glember whirled about, and I was quickly aware that the joke had expired. I could not throw my arms up to protect myself from his fist with the contraption. When I awoke some time later, there was a large tender area in the center of my face. My lip was split open. Glember, I realized, was kicking me to wake me. I looked around and nearly raised my hand to my face before I remembered the chains. "Get up, human," Glember said. There was no compassion in his tone, and I saw 2 of his 3 knuckles were bloodied on one hand. I managed to get to my feet, and we were on our way once again. I still think it was worth it. I've learned that when you are going to die, it is good to laugh. And although I was in a great deal of pain, I was smiling, laughing quietly at times. "My offer still stands," I said softly. Day 33. It was time I escaped. This had been the prevailing thought since I met Glember, of course, yet we are often plagued by thoughts that consume us without realizing the strength to assume the solution. I was no longer simply preoccupied. I was determined to end this now, and would throw the full force of my physical strength, my mental faculties, and my emotional drive into this. Throughout that day, I relaxed my arms, relaxed my fingers. I allowed my face to remain expressionless. Had I a muscle that need not be tense nor flexed, I allowed it to remain dormant. I would conserve every sapling of strength allotted my mind's ability to conceive. I would not allow sleep overcome me throughout the night. Indeed, I would sleep, yet I would awaken early. I took to coughing and sniffing. Glember turned to me several times, muttering something about how I'd slow our travels if I was succumbing to a sickness. That it was believable instilled me with that vestige of hope long slain in its depths of my will. I'd fall with sleep early, feigning fatigue, despite the opposite truth. and while Glember slept, I'd rise and take my freedom back. It was the staff that gave me the idea, you see. One end was an elaborate work the wizards of Nye doubtless used for their magic. The other end, though, was merely smooth wood. I had taken to using this end to support my weight and push aside vegetation. At some point, perhaps from growing wet and then dry betimes, it cracked. Perhaps it happened when I struck a scorpion sitting atop a stone in our path. Whatever the cause, the staff had a split gracing its once proud end. With scrutinizing eyes, I was crawling over the craggy path until I found a thin, sharp stone, one that could be wedged into the staff. The staff was much too rounded and blunt to do any damage of its own, you see, and the wood it was carved of was, although strong, very light in weight. I suppose wizards are not known for their physical strength. The light staff would not fell Glember, I knew. Yet a piercing in the heart or neck would see the task through. I'd take Glember in his slumber. I doubted I could make it home on my own, yet I'd no longer play this vile game. I'd no longer march to my death for the whim of an insane beast. I had tried as best I could to seize hold of any tendril of compassion within his deep and wretched heart, and was rewarded with little more than a few words. I'd not thwart his nature. How could he be anything but a monster? By day's end we came to a narrow pass. I could not discern in the gloom how far it stretched, yet it was obviously a long way through. Glember insisted we make camp here, rather than in the wind-sheltered ravine. Dangers, he insisted, often lurked there, awaiting the unwary eye, and beneath the darkness and our fatigue, such a trespass would not be wise. With your coughing and sniffling, Glember added, you'd give us away, and invite predators. Although he spoke of the ravine ahead, the Gargol was looking to the south, as he had often been since the sun began its descent. Something troubling you? I asked, following his gaze. Glember released his pack and let it fall to the ground. He did not answer, but began to stretch. He was tired, it appeared. I took some comfort in this. He'd be dead before morning. Get some sleep, human, Glember said. He began to unravel something from his pack. I later called it simply the web. It consisted of 2 rings of thin rope from which sprouted many ropes in all directions. There were no trees to tie me to here on this plain of shrubs. To keep me still, he tied these around each of my wrists beside the steel shackles of the contraption I already wore. He sent the long ropes out in all directions from each of the 2 bindings, roping these around various shrubs, all of which converged where he would lay a safe distance from me. Were I to move either wrist in any direction, it would tug at least one, more likely several, of the ropes and alert him. This was going to complicate my plan, and yet, before I fell asleep, I had the issue resolved. Day 34. That night, a dream came to call. I dreamt that I was attacked by some vicious monster, a coarse-haired, wolf-like creature. It was like nothing I had seen before, ferocious and fast. I could not fight it off nor fend myself, and wrestled violently with tall reed grass in an attempt to escape, only to fall. The creature came on relentlessly, claws swiping for my throat and face. I covered my face and throat with my arms and hands as I ran for my home. Its claws came on mercilessly, hacking at me and tearing the back of my hand open. I jerked to wakefulness, causing the web to tug at various strings. I heard Glember mumble something in the distance, although it appeared as though he had said it half in sleep. He moved one of his hands, and I felt my right wrist get tugged about. He then moved a rockabout that was hanging above him, and I felt my left wrist tugged about a little. I went very still, even began to breathe more heavily, as though I was taken quickly back to the realm of sleep. After some time, I could hear Glember's heavy breathing. It was time, I decided. Very slowly, beneath the starry night sky, as the tiny nocturnal creatures alone sounded in the distance, I began to work the end of the wizard's staff into the ground, having run it through one of the web bindings. I had learned I could move about the distance of my hand before it tugged at any string enough to move Glember's converged bindings. He had this wrapped to one of his own wrists, of course, and in some other fashion, to a weight that hung above him. I suspected the weight would fall if any of the strings broke. I had to be careful and patient with my efforts. The earth was soft, and ever so slowly the staff began to burrow in. Once sufficiently impaled into the earth, I retrieved my fine-edged rock and began to cut away on the binding now looping the staff, for I could not pull my hand out of the binding. Too, each of its runner ropes was looped around the wrist ring, so that any cut to the ring would cause all ropes to slip free of the ring. If this happened, there would no longer be tension on the rope leading to Glember's wrist, should he check it. When the ring was nearly cut, I gripped hold of one side with my teeth and pressed my knee against the other side, wedging the web bracer between my knee and wrist. I began to rub the rock against the wrist binding once again, fraying it slowly until it was severed. Carefully, I lifted the end, my teeth held, into the split crevice of the protruding end of the staff. It held. It was much more difficult to get a grip on the other side of the binding wedged between my knee and wrist with my teeth. I was soaked in sweat by now, both for the effort of my straining muscles and the fear I would be discovered. My strength was slipping away, and I nearly let slip the second end of the binding before managing to get a grip on it. Once done, my wrist and hand were free. I grabbed hold of it with my fingers and pressed it into the end of the staff beside the first. The second wrist was much easier to unbind with one of my hands now free. However, I had not the length allotted to bring my two hands together. I could not tie the bindings from the second wrist web to the staff. They would not reach. I sat there for a long time, holding the bindings in my second free hand, not knowing what to do with them. I could sit or even stand now, and yet I could not let go of the strings or move them without alerting Glember. I thought I heard something in the distance to the south. I turned quickly in that direction, peering into the thick darkness. I could see nothing. Far off, trees rose and darkened the background of the view. I could see nothing. I turned back toward Glember. It seemed he remained asleep. In my movements, however, I discovered, or remembered, the second binding was to the weight held aloft above Glember from a perched position formed by the union of three sticks. It was swinging back and forth above him slightly. The first binding, you may recall, was to Glember himself. I needed something heavier than that object to place atop this ring, for I had already retied it. It was then I smiled. The fatigue of this journey and the tension of my mind was plaguing me so that I could not think as clearly as I liked. I could simply let the binding go now, its runners strung out in various directions before heading toward that rock above Glember. The tension should be equal on all of the strings, I consoled myself. I began to relax my grip on the binding. The sound came again, startling me. I gripped again the binding tightly. Again, Glember did not hear it, yet I was certain whatever caused the noise was closer. The first time, I thought it was the sound of a sandal skidding over a rocky path. This time, it sounded as if a stick struck against a stone. Again, my eyes darted here and there to no avail. It was much too dark. I waited until I was sure I could hear the gargle breathing before I let the binding go. It held fast where my wrist once lay bound by it. My hands were free. And yet the staff, my only weapon, lay stuck into the earth at an angle holding the first ring in place. I pulled the ring free of the staff and tied its end, allowing it to hang freely as the first. Move as I did, the bindings would no longer alert Glember. I forced the sharp, flat rock into the crack of the staff, making sure its sharp and pointed end jutted outward. The staff was now a spear. I crept silently toward Glember. Each step I took, I felt along the earth, sifting through the soil for sticks that would alert the monster of my progression. Glember shifted. It was as though I was frozen. I did neither breathe nor blink. He reached up and shook the stone as well as his wrist. My eyes widened in horror before I realized all should be well. They would simply jostle my wrist about, and yet I could not muster courage enough to breathe. Glember shook the rock and his wrist a second time. Did he notice? I wondered. Then I realized he was wanting some kind of a reaction from me. I turned my head in the direction where I once lay. I cupped my hands over my mouth and muttered softly enough that it would be taken for only a notice of the movement. It must have appeared to come from the correct direction, for Glember pulled his skins over himself and turned to his side once again. I sat there crouched in the darkness with only the wind. Although it was not cold, my hands and feet were nearly frozen, it seemed. A while ago, they burned with heat and sweat. It was the tension, I knew. My sweat was evaporating in the breeze, and my heart was pounding. I'd begun to shiver. Slowly, I began to creep toward Glember once again. I lifted the spear now, pointing it toward Glember. I could not thrust my arms completely forward without activating the Xiron spike of the contraption, but I could trust the spear enough to go through his neck. I practiced the movement silently as I neared. By twisting my body, I could double both the force and the distance of the thrust. I knew it would be enough to see the task through. I was close enough now to debate the logic of sifting through the soil for sticks. It was quite possible he would hear this. Perhaps there were no sticks. Perhaps it was better to be prepared with the spear. Although cold, my hands were damp. I rubbed them off on my clothes. I would need a firm grip. I looked over the soil. I could see no sticks, no leaves, nothing that appeared would sound into the night beneath my footfalls. 2 more steps would take me there. 2 more steps would bring my freedom. 2 more steps, and I'd be free of this monster forever. I took another step, allowing my weight to shift very slowly to that step. It came down upon the earth ever so gently. No sound came forth. I completed shifting the full of my weight to the newly gained earth. I drew my second leg forward slowly, as though the air alone may sound if I move too quickly. I placed it gently upon the earth. I let the weight shift until I was balanced between the two. I shifted both feet back and forth, making sure I had a good foothold for the thrust. Glember was facing the opposite direction on his side, his right wrist resting atop his side and his left wrist tucked under his body. The right side of his neck was exposed, with neither skin nor shoulder protecting it. I moved the spear into position, leaning forward. I stood over him now. It would be over soon. The damned sound came again from the distance. Glember stopped breathing. Perhaps one known to battle would not have hesitated to thrust the spear forward, yet I turned toward the sound on instinct. I thought this time I could see something moving in the distance, a person perhaps. The noise sounded more like a voice this time, a low mutter carried in on the wind that betook us from the south. When I turned back toward Glember, he was motionless, and then he began to turn to his back. He lay there with his back against the ground facing the sky with the entirety of his neck exposed. I moved the spear to rest just over his throat. He took a deep breath and scratched his face before relaxing his arm back to his side. All the while, his eyes remained closed. True, I would yet be burdened with the contraption were the beast slain. I considered this as I crept toward him. It was no longer worth the risk. A possible death to the contraption as I fell, or a possible death to some beast seemed not as great a risk as sure death to Glember. He made quite clear his intentions. He would slay me in the Temple of the 8 Walls when we reached his homeland. No, I'd dare the lands with the contraption. Glember was going to die. His eyes opened then. He blinked twice, and had begun to take in a deep breath to yawn before it dissolved with his recognition of me standing over him, the spear nearly resting against his throat. He said nothing. He did not plea. He did not move. He simply looked up into my eyes as the moment stretched impossibly long. He looked at the rock and then to my wrists. Perhaps he was curious, and still he said nothing. He did not move to protect his neck, nor attempt to thrust the spear aside. "No last words, Gargol?" I asked. Glember shrugged slightly, as if he had little care. "No begging for your life?" I asked. Why hadn't I thrust the spear forward, ending it? I asked myself. Glember took a slow breath in and released it. "What is left to me in life to beg for?" he asked. There was a moment of silence, in which I tried to make sense of his words. He was looking up at me, as though he pitied me for the first time, and then he closed his eyes and moved his shoulders down and away from his body. He turned his head upward. He stared off with his neck more exposed, waiting. I could see the side of his neck where his heartbeat pulsed. It was slow and even. He was not afraid, and yet mine was pounding. I could feel sweat running down my back. My hands were damp again, and my legs felt as though they wanted to shake with fear and were yet cold all at once. I let out a growl and clenched my teeth and fists, raising the spear a little and jerking it toward Glember. I stopped just short of his neck. Perhaps I even touched against his skin. I cannot say. He did not react. He did neither blink nor flinch. I made the gesture once again. His gaze, although distanced, was not so turned that he could not see my movements. I yelled this time as I made the motion, flexing every last muscle in my body, and still there came no reaction from the Gargol. He didn't care if he died. He didn't care at all. "Why, Gargol?" I asked as I looked down upon his pitiful predicament, one I had been in for some time. "Why aren't you afraid?" Glember said nothing. He appeared to be in the throes of a memory. I think he wanted to die with that thought, whatever it was. I pressed the spear into his neck slowly, just enough to puncture the skin. "Aren't you afraid to die?" I asked him, and now the Gargol blinked. It seemed as though I had burdened him by pulling him from his thoughts. "I suppose I am human," Glember said softly, and added, "I don't know." "You don't know if you're afraid?" I asked. The notion was ridiculous. This beast was mad. One moment he was dragging me to my death, torturing my mind with each step, and now he lay prone to death, and he would not so much as raise an arm or word to defend himself. "I think human," the Gargol answered. "I think I'm just more afraid of life." He was nodding, ever so slightly as he said it, as if it was something he understood, not merely a statement or answer, but the voice of his depths. I stood there over him, at times gripping tighter the spear, at times taking in deep breaths. I could not go through with it. "Why can't I kill you?" I asked. It came out low, as much a question to me as the Gargol. "Because you too are dying," Glember said. I blinked and swallowed, taking in a deep breath once more. What did the Gargol imply? Had I been poisoned again? Was I going to die regardless of freeing myself of this monster or not? I grazed the spear along his neck, enough to tear the skin and make it bleed. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "What did you do to me?" Glember looked up at me. "You've been dying since you left your home," he said calmly. "You just don't know it." "What?" I asked. I heard another noise from the south again and turned to my left just as the great light erupted in that direction. I saw an intense yellow-white light growing larger and larger, blinding me as it came. I jerked my head backward in just enough time to dodge the crackling orb. I watched as it continued on its way, striking the earth in the distance, leaving in its wake red molten rock, burned and flaming shrubs and glowing sands. When I turned back to the south again, the sky was once more lighting up. This time I saw from whence the assault came. 4 robed men were walking quickly toward us, muttering words and moving their arms about. "The wizards of Nye," Glember said from where he lay. This concludes Part 8 of 17 of Glember, The Tale of a Monster. You're listening to the first book of the Meristherian Trilogy. Please subscribe if you like the content, where you'll have access to additional books. Feel free to support this channel by telling others about it. These books are free to listen to, as you know, and everyone's welcome here. Leave a friendly comment if you like. Again, this is AK. Thanks for listening, friends, and see you next time.